On the morning of 11 March 1945, at Kanoya Air Base on Kyushu, an intelligence officer studied a set of photographs with a level of unease he could not hide. The images, taken by submarine I-47 during a covert approach toward the American anchorage at Ulithi, contained an observation that would unsettle senior figures in the Imperial Japanese Navy for the rest of the conflict. His report noted the presence of an unfamiliar structure, a large vessel constructed of concrete, unarmed, fitted with extensive refrigeration machinery, and surrounded by several small boats engaged in loading and unloading tasks. Its function could not be determined. The grainy periscope images contradicted every assumption Japanese strategists still held about American priorities. At Kanoya itself, pilots and ground crews were resorting to increasingly desperate improvisations. Aviation fuel was so scarce that the airfield was participating in a nationwide project, more than 34,000 pine root distillation units operating across Japan, that collectively produced only around 3,000 barrels of substitute fuel. Mechanics scavenged industrial alcohol from factory equipment merely to keep engines turning over. Yet the photographs suggested that, in the midst of total war, the United States had allocated resources to maintain a ship apparently dedicated to refrigerated storage. On the runway, 24 Yokosuka P-1Y-1 Francis bombers prepared for Operation Ton No. 2, a mission in which pilots, many with barely 50 flight hours, would take off knowing that their aircraft, packed with explosives and stripped for speed, were intended not to return. None of them were aware that they would soon be striking a fleet that had invested in what amounted to a floating industrial plant capable of producing immense quantities of frozen dessert. The vessel documented by submarine reconnaissance, a converted U.S. Army concrete barge known as a Barge Refrigerated Large, or BRL, had been refitted at a cost of roughly $1 million wartime dollars, equivalent to more than $170 million in 2024. Its output was extraordinary, approximately 500 gallons of ice cream per production cycle, totaling 5 tons per day, a scale of comfort unimaginable to Japanese servicemen who were stripping forests for fuel. Hints of this disparity had surfaced earlier through prisoner interrogations after the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. When the carrier Zuikaku went down on 25 October, hundreds of Japanese sailors were pulled from the oil-covered sea by U.S. destroyers, including Wakatsuki and Kua. Of the carrier's complement, 862 men were rescued, while 842 died. The survivors, expecting brutal treatment or worse, instead received medical attention and regular rations. Some recounted being handed a cold dessert unfamiliar to most of them. One interrogation record contains a remark from a rescued sailor who described being offered a sweet frozen mixture the Americans called ice cream. He explained that, although he had heard of such a dish, he had never tasted it. To him, the fact that his former adversaries distributed it even after the most violent fleet engagement in history was almost incomprehensible. Reports of American comfort and abundance clash directly with the narrative insisted upon by Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of the kamikaze special attack units. Onishi suppressed such accounts, fearing that acknowledging American material superiority and their apparent ability to retain a high standard of living even at the front would erode the last remnants of morale among his pilots. Their training, aircraft, and fuel were declining in quality. Only the belief in spiritual advantage remained. The earliest Japanese observation of the mysterious refrigeration platform actually predated the Kanoya report. In December 1944, submarine I-47, commanded by Zenji Orita, had surfaced near Ulithi to conduct periscope reconnaissance before deploying Kaitan-man torpedoes. Orita, who had led the submarine since 10 July 1944, recorded in his log at 0630 hours a sighting of a large, roughly 80-meter concrete vessel, unarmed yet equipped with substantial refrigeration installations. He also noted a steady flow of smaller craft alongside it. At the time, the object defied classification. Only later, when Japanese archival documents were compared with Allied records, did historians confirm that Orita had encountered the U.S. Navy's BRL, the floating refrigeration barge that symbolized the chasm between American industrial power and Japan's shrinking wartime resources. A specialized production vessel once operated as a floating ice cream plant, capable of turning out roughly 10 gallons every 7 minutes. Its cold storage holds maintained about 2,000 gallons at a steady 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The barge ran without interruption, day and night, 7 days a week, delivering around 500 gallons per work shift, amounting to nearly 5 tons of frozen product in a single day. By the opening months of 1945, conditions within Japan had deteriorated to a level that observers outside the country struggled to fathom. Petroleum reserves were nearly exhausted. The battleship Yamato, symbol of the Imperial Navy's pride, was so short on fuel that much of its crew training had to be conducted while the ship remained anchored, simply to avoid burning precious oil. Attempts to alleviate the crisis bordered on the desperate. The so-called Pine Root Oil Program, an immense mobilization involving some 34,000 crude distillation units and hundreds of thousands of laborers, even drawing millions of schoolchildren into supporting tasks, managed to extract only about 3,000 barrels of aviation-grade fuel from 70,000 barrels of pine-derived oil. This entire effort yielded less than what the U.S. Navy expended in a single full day of frontline operations. Japan's last premier fighter formation, the 343rd Naval Air Group, Kokutai, faced its own crisis. Commanded from January 15, 1945, by Captain Minoru Genda, better known as a key planner of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the unit wrestled with severe nutritional shortages. Although precise caloric intake figures were not systematically logged, pilots frequently reported symptoms linked to vitamin deficiency, deteriorating night vision, sluggish reaction times, and an inability to tolerate high-G maneuvers. In internal reports, Genda lamented, "My airmen lose their sight in darkness. Hunger has robbed them of their strength. They tremble during combat turns, while the opponent grows more formidable each day." Nowhere was the contrast more tragic than in the ranks preparing for kamikaze sorties. Many of these young aviators, some still in their late teens, went into their final missions with only about 40 to 50 hours of flight practice. Their last meals were simple offerings: rice balls, strips of dried fish, and a ceremonial cup of sake. Each wore a senbari, a 1,000-stitch waistband sewn by numerous women as a gesture of spiritual protection, though everyone understood that no charm could shield an aircraft from the firepower of Allied fleets. At Kanoya Air Base on March 11, 1945, pilots assigned to suicide operations composed their farewell verses before walking toward their aircraft. One such poem, still displayed at the Kanoya Air Base Museum, reads, "As cherry blossoms fall in spring, so shall we descend, unstained and shining." That same evening at 20:07 hours, attackers sought to strike U.S. naval forces at Ulithi. A Ginga, France's twin-engine bomber, succeeded in ramming the stern of the aircraft carrier USS Randolph, CV-15. The explosion and ensuing fires killed 25 sailors and left more than 100 wounded, marking one of many tragic final acts in the conflict's closing months. The aircraft carrier was restored to operational condition within a remarkably brief period of 3 weeks, utilizing approximately 29 tons of structural steel, which included I-beams repurposed from a Japanese sugar refinery located on Saipan. During this repair period, the crew's consumption of ice cream from nearby base facilities reached nearly 3,000 gallons, a reflection of the extraordinary logistical support available at the time. Ulithi Atoll, though a minor and often overlooked coral formation on many maps, had evolved into a naval hub of unprecedented scale, far exceeding the size of the Japanese fleet at its historical peak. By March 1945, the lagoon sheltered 722 vessels, serving as the primary staging ground for the Okinawa campaign and hosting more ships than Japan could ever deploy. The infrastructure at Ulithi defied conventional expectations. Fully equipped machine shops operated from floating dry docks, and a fleet post office processed around 20 tons of mail each day. Recreational and morale facilities included movie theaters screening Hollywood productions, baseball fields on Mogmog Island, and a continuously operating bakery ship producing fresh bread. The USS Abatan undertook both seawater distillation and pie baking, while a dedicated ice cream barge generated up to 5 tons of frozen desserts daily. This ice cream operation became a hallmark of American naval life, extending service across all ranks from admiral to enlisted sailor. Even ships without onboard refrigeration would dispatch boats with empty containers to collect ice cream from the barge, ensuring equitable access to the treat. Japanese intelligence was perplexed by the American prioritization of such comforts amid total war. Captain Tomichi Fara, one of Japan's most accomplished destroyer commanders who survived every major engagement from Pearl Harbor through the war's conclusion, documented his bewilderment in later memoirs. Hara, commanding destroyers including the Amatsukaze and Shigur, and participating in 14 major battles, recounted his disbelief upon learning that American supply chains allocated significant resources to ice cream. Initially, Japanese analysts suspected that Allied supply manifests had been coded. Ice cream was presumed to be ammunition, chocolate syrup to signify fuel, and strawberry topping to indicate medical supplies. The idea that any military force would dedicate such volumes of resources to dessert during active combat seemed implausible. However, captured sailors consistently confirmed the presence of ice cream on every American vessel larger than a destroyer. Reconnaissance revealed refrigerated ships at all major bases, and supply documentation showed tonnage allocated for morale provisions exceeding the total rations available to entire Japanese fleets. Commander Mochitsu Hashimoto of the Japanese submarine I-58, later responsible for sinking the USS Indianapolis, provided detailed observations of American logistics. During reconnaissance missions, he noted through his periscope the presence of what he described as floating cities of abundance. While Japanese crews rationed torpedoes and fuel with extreme precision, American sailors maintained near peacetime routines in a combat environment, demonstrating a capacity for operational continuity that the Japanese had never anticipated. Hashimoto's executive officer corroborated these impressions, remarking on lines of sailors at refreshment stations and the consistent transfer of containers later revealed to hold ice cream, rather than military supplies. Captured pilots during Operation Kikusui, the series of 10 large-scale kamikaze attacks on Okinawa between April and June 1945, provided further testimony. One pilot, forced to abort his mission due to mechanical failure, described American destroyers maintaining normal operational patterns amidst attacks, including uninterrupted food service. White uniformed sailors continued routine duties on deck, including serving ice cream, demonstrating a level of confidence in anti-aircraft defenses that allowed everyday operations to proceed even under imminent threat. By 1945, American ice cream production in the Pacific had reached industrial proportions, surpassing the scale of the entire Japanese food provisioning system. This capability was not merely a luxury, but a reflection of the logistical sophistication and morale-focused strategy that underpinned U.S. naval operations, illustrating the stark contrast between the material and operational resources available to the two adversaries. During World War II, the United States Navy operated specialized production barges in the Pacific, such as the unit stationed at Ulithi, which had a capacity of 500 gallons and produced ice cream at a rate of 10 gallons every 7 minutes. In addition, the Army deployed 3 ice cream carrying barges, collectively holding 1,500 gallons. Shipboard production was extensive. Every aircraft carrier, battleship, and cruiser was equipped with ice cream machines, while shore facilities contained multiple production plants at each major base. By 1943, the military had shipped 135 million units of dehydrated ice cream mix, a figure reflecting the broader logistical effort. The Army Quartermaster Corps oversaw an annual output totaling roughly 80 million gallons of ready-to-consume ice cream for service members. By contrast, Japanese production of comfort foods was minimal. The total output of pine root oil, an alternative ingredient for confections, amounted to only 3,000 barrels across 34,000 distillation units. Aviation fuel reserves were critically low by 1945, falling under 1.5 million barrels. Civilian nutritional intake also declined dramatically, with daily caloric consumption dropping from approximately 2,000 calories before the war to 1,680 by the summer of 1945. In Tokyo, post-war rations were even more severe, averaging 775 calories per day for a 6-month period in 1946. Pilot training in Japan faced similar constraints, with available fuel permitting only 40 to 50 hours of flight time. To contextualize, the total daily rice allotment for all Japanese home island forces was lighter in tonnage than the quantity of ice cream consumed by American troops in the Pacific Theater. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz personally sanctioned the ice cream barge program, recognizing a principle that was largely alien to the Japanese military ethos. Morale could not be sustained through ideology and self-denial alone. In a classified communication, Nimitz observed that the Japanese expected their personnel to endure extreme conditions until breaking point. In contrast, the American approach demonstrated that industrial capacity could be leveraged to maintain both operational effectiveness and personal comfort. He argued that sailors, reassured of their country's ability to provide even small luxuries, such as ice cream in the midst of combat, approached missions with a fundamentally different mindset than those conditioned only to hardship. This philosophy permeated the Pacific Fleet. A notable incident occurred on May 8, 1942, during the Battle of the Coral Sea aboard the USS Lexington. As the ship was being abandoned, crew members famously salvaged ice cream from ship stores, scooping it into helmets before entering life rafts. For Japanese observers, such behavior was incomprehensible. It directly contradicted their cultural assumption that resilience was built exclusively through deprivation and sacrifice. Japanese naval leadership, once informed of American ice cream operations, faced a dilemma. They had to reconcile the traditional belief that discipline and fortitude alone sustained fighting spirit with evidence that U.S. forces maintained morale through tangible comforts. Reports highlighted the disparity. While Japanese sailors could receive as little as 315 grams of rice per day, Americans could consume several tons of ice cream from a single barge. Admiral Matome Ugaki, who later commanded the final kamikaze missions, recorded in his diary that these intelligence reports suggested a profound miscalculation of the war's nature. He noted that sheer spirit could not overcome an adversary who combined determination with tangible luxuries. The United States classified these morale programs at a level higher than top secret. Officers who became aware of them were bound by absolute secrecy. Nevertheless, word of the operations inevitably trickled through. Japanese radar operators observed B-29 bombers circling at high altitudes without clear tactical objectives. Post-war investigations revealed a reason. Crews were producing ice cream in flight. By mixing powdered milk, sugar, and cocoa in ammunition cans and using the extreme cold at 30,000 feet, reaching temperatures near -50 degrees Fahrenheit, the turbulence of high-altitude flight acted as a makeshift freezing mechanism. This combination of industrial production, logistical planning, and morale consideration illustrated a fundamentally different approach to sustaining military effectiveness. Whereas Japanese doctrine emphasized endurance through deprivation, the U.S. Navy demonstrated that comfort and morale could be deliberately engineered to enhance combat readiness and operational resilience. Even amid violent turbulence above the Pacific, American crews found the resources and confidence to produce ice cream in the midst of enemy territory, where Japanese pilots struggled to keep their aircraft aloft using fuel derived from pine roots, illustrates the extraordinary industrial and societal surplus the United States could bring to wartime operations. While Japanese ground crews resorted to burning hydraulic fluids and other emergency fuels to keep their planes operational, American airmen were devising makeshift ice cream machines at cruising altitude, turning comfort into a tool of morale. Between 6 April and 22 June 1945, Operation Kikusui unleashed 10 successive waves of kamikaze attacks against the American fleet at Okinawa. During these months, a total of 1,465 kamikaze aircraft were destroyed, claiming the lives of approximately 4,000 Japanese pilots. The attackers flew largely outdated aircraft, often powered by alcohol-diluted fuel that reduced engine efficiency by around 30%. Their last meals typically consisted of little more than rice balls and water, frequently the only substantial nourishment they had in several days. During the massive assault on 6 April 1945, which involved 355 kamikaze aircraft, 6 American ships were sunk and 22 more were damaged. Yet post-action reports from the fleet emphasized morale as high, noting a remarkable 40% increase in ice cream consumption following combat. The psychological significance of these frozen treats cannot be understated. They symbolized home, stability, and the possibility of normalcy amid the chaos of battle. Accounts from Japanese personnel captured during the Okinawa campaign, 11,250 in total, provided insights that fundamentally contradicted Japanese assumptions about American vulnerability. One officer, rescued from the water after his destroyer went down, recounted, through interpreters, an experience that left a lasting impression. He had anticipated harsh treatment or even execution, recalling the brutal handling of American prisoners. Instead, he was handed vanilla ice cream in a metal cup by a young sailor, apparently apologetic that chocolate was unavailable. The officer later reflected that he did not weep out of gratitude, but from the recognition that Japan had already lost. A nation capable of serving ice cream to its enemies before a battle had established its victory in principle. These personal testimonies, though largely suppressed during the war, were documented in Allied occupation records. They revealed a profound disparity between the two nations' approaches to conflict, one rooted in scarcity and suffering, the other bolstered by industrial capacity and a belief in abundance. Beginning in August 1945, U.S. occupation forces extended this practice to the Japanese civilian population, distributing ice cream to children who had never tasted it. The gesture had a deep psychological impact, undermining decades of propaganda portraying Americans as cruel and weak. Even celebrated Japanese figures confronted this reality. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, Japan's surviving ace with 64 confirmed aerial victories, first experienced ice cream at an American airbase in 1946. In his memoir, Samurai Colin, he reflected on the broader lesson. Japan had believed suffering forged strength, while the United States fought with the security of abundance. Comfort, which the Japanese associated with weakness, was treated by their adversaries as a right, guaranteed anywhere through industrial capability. The quantitative contrast between the two nations underscores this point. By 1945, American forces had achieved staggering output. The Navy's refrigerated barge produced roughly 500 gallons of ice cream per day, or about 10 gallons every 7 minutes, while the Army operated 3 similar vessels, generating a combined 1,500 gallons daily. Taken together, these operations amounted to nearly 80 million gallons of ice cream annually, a scale of production entirely unmatched by Japan and emblematic of a fundamentally different kind of war, one in which industrial abundance itself became a weapon. During 1943, dehydrated ice cream mixes were produced on a massive scale, with millions of units shipped to Allied forces worldwide. Naval vessels, particularly all ships larger than destroyers, were equipped with onboard ice cream machines. Each production barge carried a price tag of roughly $1 million at the time, a figure equivalent to approximately $17 million in 2024, reflecting the enormous investment the United States made in maintaining troop morale through food comforts. By contrast, Japanese conditions in early 1945 were grim. Sailors were often limited to just 315 grams of rice per day when rations were available. Efforts to supplement fuel for aircraft included the nationwide Pine Root Oil Program, which mobilized 400,000 workers and deployed 34,000 distillation units, ultimately producing a mere 3,000 barrels of aviation-grade fuel from 70,000 barrels of raw pine oil. Pilot training had been drastically curtailed as well. Where pre-war programs had required over 500 hours of instruction, by 1945, trainee pilots often received only 40 to 50 hours of flight preparation. Even the fuel itself was compromised, with a 30% alcohol mixture reducing engine efficiency and performance. Within the context of Japan's military ethos, built on the principles of Bushido, the code of the warrior emphasizing honor, discipline, and the spiritual value of enduring suffering, these developments highlighted a stark contrast with the American approach. To Japanese officers, the existence of American ice cream ships seemed almost inconceivable. Rather than perceiving comfort as a weakness, the United States demonstrated that well-fed and morale-supported soldiers could operate more effectively. Abundance and the provision of non-essential luxuries were not indulgences, but strategic tools, signaling confidence and logistical supremacy. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who survived the war after leading the attack on Pearl Harbor, later converted to Christianity and adopted pacifist beliefs. Reflecting on his transformation, he noted that witnessing Americans feed ice cream to their troops, even in wartime, challenged his preconceptions. It was not merely sustenance, it was a deliberate cultivation of morale, a symbol of civilization secure enough to extend kindness to its fighters, even while engaged in total war. The ice cream vessels stood as a tangible illustration that American strategy encompassed not only firepower, but also the capacity to sustain human well-being, a concept largely alien to Japanese military doctrine. Decades later, at a 1985 U.S.-Japan Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, the contrast remained striking. Robert Mitchell, a former construction battalion serviceman stationed at Ulithi, was asked by Japanese veterans about the ice cream barge. He casually recalled, "We figured boys fighting needed ice cream. Didn't seem extraordinary. It was just what we did. If we could make it, we made it. Taking care of the troops was standard procedure." This nonchalance, treating luxury food as routine and expected, underscored a profound cultural and operational divergence between the two navies, far more illustrative than any combat statistic. Tadamasa Itatsu, a former kamikaze pilot trainer attending the same reunion, observed, "We trained our boys to face death on empty stomachs. You trained your boys to live, even enjoy dessert." That difference explains everything about how the war unfolded. In his Pulitzer Prize-winning account, Embracing Defeat, Japan in the Wake of World War II, Dr. John Dower emphasized the symbolic weight of the Ulithi ice cream barge. He argued that it represented more than a supply vessel. It conveyed a message of American industrial and psychological dominance. "This is proof we can afford comfort amid war. We are already in control, and you are yet to comprehend it." Military historian Richard Frank echoed this perspective, noting that while Japanese forces prepared to meet death with honor, the American approach subtly demonstrated power through the simple yet profound act of sustaining life and morale. American forces entered combat with the expectation that they could maintain comfort even in the midst of war. This was not merely a tactical variation. It reflected a fundamentally different cultural approach to military conflict. At the Kanoya Air Base Museum in Kagoshima Prefecture, a small plaque added in the 1990s quietly acknowledges the presence of American ice cream vessels. It is one of the few reminders for visitors of the extraordinary logistical contrast faced by kamikaze pilots who departed from this base. Among the exhibits, the pilot's final meal, a modest rice ball, pickled vegetables, and a cup of sake, is displayed alongside a photograph from U.S. Navy archives showing an ice cream barge at Ulithi. The juxtaposition requires no further commentary. It conveys the stark imbalance between the opposing forces more clearly than words could. Museum curator Taisi Yamada noted that the display helps younger generations grasp the scale of Japan's defeat. When they see that America commissions ships solely to produce ice cream while we were forced to extract fuel from pine roots, it becomes clear that this was not just a military loss, Yamada explained. It was the collision of scarcity and abundance. The discovery of American ice cream operations by Japanese commanders illustrates a central lesson about modern warfare: the nature of power itself. Japanese strategy had long equated strength with endurance, spirit, and the capacity to endure extreme deprivation. The United States, by contrast, demonstrated that real power lay in the ability to provide abundance, to prevent suffering, and to maintain normalcy even under severe conditions. Kamikaze pilots performing heroic and self-sacrificial missions were up against an adversary whose conception of war was fundamentally different. While Japanese forces extracted approximately 3,000 barrels of aviation fuel from 34,000 distillation units built from pine roots, American engineers constructed million-dollar ice cream barges. Where Japanese pilots composed farewell death poems and completed 40 to 50-hour training flights on diluted fuel, American sailors spent their time selecting between vanilla and chocolate. Japan measured success in terms of spiritual achievement. The United States measured it in industrial output, including the production of 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes aboard a single barge. The conclusion of the war did not result from a lack of willing Japanese pilots. They persisted to the end, but from Japan's eventual recognition of the magnitude of its opponent's resources. They were confronting not just a military force, but a society capable of sustaining comfort and luxury alongside global conflict. The U.S. Navy's ice cream barges embodied confidence, abundance, and an operational philosophy that permitted wastefulness in the service of morale while fighting a world war. Numbers illustrate the disparity clearly. At Ulithi, 722 American vessels were anchored, more than Japan ever possessed at its naval peak. A single ice cream barge could produce 500 gallons per shift, while Japan's total aviation fuel output from pine roots was only 3,000 barrels. American bomber crews manufactured ice cream at 30,000 feet. Japanese aviators trained for 40 to 50 hours on rationed, diluted fuel. Sailors debated flavors in the Pacific. Japanese seamen subsisted on 315 grams of rice when supplies were available. Japanese officers who discovered American dessert operations encountered more than an unusual logistical choice. They encountered proof of a society that had already achieved victory, confident and untroubled, bringing comfort even to a battlefield. The ice cream ships prefigured the conclusion that the atomic bombs later confirmed. Japan fought the final campaign of scarcity against the first campaign of abundance. The outcome was inevitable, though utterly bewildering to those who equated suffering with strength. True power, the Americans demonstrated, is the capacity to prevent hardship entirely. The million-dollar ice cream barge at Ulithi, producing 10 gallons every 7 minutes while Japanese pilots prepared for self-sacrifice, was more than a vessel. It was a symbol of a civilization that had effectively won the conflict before it began. In a world defined by fuel shortages and extreme austerity, these barges signified a profound strategic and cultural superiority. Japan brought endurance to a contest governed by industrial abundance. They brought suffering to a confrontation defined by comfort. By the standards of the Pacific War, they had already lost before the first kamikaze left the ground.